In the 1950s, there was a scourge that hit the whole world. It was known as polio, a disease stemming from polluted water entering the mouth that made the majority of people only slightly ill. A small number found it started to leave them immobilised in some way. In the worst cases, the net result was paralysis. Some lived out their entire lifespan locked in structures known as iron lungs. Almost all of their basic functions had to be aided by continuous medical assistance. The most hard hit of those who suffered from it were the otherwise most active individuals in the community, children. I was one of those unlucky casualties. Survivors of that epidemic today, now entering their last decades of life, are having some of the old symptoms and effects revisiting them once again. This story of a society and a time that is now generally viewed as comfortable and conventional and above all complacent, in fact had more than its share of shocks. That story was my story as well. Well, my polio story started here in Adelaide when I was probably about 3.5. I had been at kindergarten, and my grandfather's usual practice was to come and meet me after kindergarten and take me home on the tram. And I either couldn't or wouldn't walk. By that night I was diagnosed with suspected polio.
I started seeing equipment in the school hall of the Uralla Crippled Children's Centre when we were having our guide meetings there. And I was fascinated by all the range of standing equipment and the calipers and special trolleys for children to lie on who couldn't sit up for very long. And then a few years later we had a lass join the company who'd had polio herself. So we started to understand a bit more about what it was like to live with this disability. I had 6 months at Northfield, infectious disease. Then I had time in the Children's Hospital and then rehabilitation at Escott House. It was a pretty hard time. I was strapped to a frame and bandaged, not able to move, and these were interspersed with exercises and practices in moving different sorts of muscles that I'd lost tone in. Children were made to work and made to have their calipers on. There was no choice for them. Nobody explained to them what was going on. They weren't involved, and sometimes were only allowed to see their parents for 20 minutes once a week. I eventually got home when I was probably 6. I think me having polio was pretty devastating for our family. My father was totally blind. He'd been blind since a child, and he was a musician. And my mother had only recently nursed both her sister and her mother with terminal breast cancer. So I think having a child diagnosed with polio in that area was probably pretty tough. And there were no more children after me. I eventually got to school and enjoyed it. I still had a caliper brace on my legs till I was 11. By the time I went to high school, there was no real visible traces that I'd ever had polio. In our first year, we were meeting at the Fairfield Hospital and we saw people in iron lungs. And these iron lungs were the cabins that people would have to lie in to breathe. And some of them survived in those for 40 years. A pretty horrendous way to live with that level of disability. There was no people left in South Australia living in iron lungs because there'd been a power failure at the hospital, whereas in Victoria there was still one when I went back there 40 years later. Post-polio syndrome started to emerge about 10 to 15 years after people had first had polio. All sorts of different age groups. It was sometimes a 35-year-old who'd had polio at age 20. They started to get new weakness, fatigue and pain, sometimes in the polio muscle, sometimes in the muscles they thought were normal, but they'd actually only recovered about 60%, and they'd worn out these supposedly normal muscles in overcompensating. Everybody's been different, every type of disability and pain levels and fatigue levels, everybody's different. It hasn't really stopped me doing a lot. I've travelled a lot and sometimes alone, sometimes with other people. I think I noticed when I was in my early 50s that I was often more tired than other people, and I didn't know whether this was menopause, just
getting older or quite what or working too hard. But I think I probably have had some very slight post-polio symptoms. So I think just a little bit more of tiring than other people is the main effect that I've got. So I think I'm very, very lucky.
There are other issues as well as some of those physical mechanical issues. They have word finding problems, they have concentration problems, they have short-term memory problems, and that can be difficult at work. By the time they're 45, 50, they think, oh, is this a bit of burnout, or is it that they're just tired of their job? But it is because there was some brain damage early on. The best thing to do now is to have a full medical assessment to make sure that the pain that they're getting may not be necessarily polio, to not blame everything on the polio. So it's important to have a full medical workup to make sure that there's nothing else going on.
I haven't been involved in any of the post-polio groups or organisations till I started to research this film, but I have found out that the Polio.org website really urges people to register. I think what polio really taught me something was about being very independent. I think I had to learn to rely on myself at a very early age, and I think that sort of played out a bit in later life.
Yes, the polio support groups that gradually emerged and built up all around Australia have been helpful. There's gradually been enough research to show that you can work on that secondary disability and help people cope much better than they were initially.